Well, hello everyone. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, Conflict Minerals Compliance in 2016, How to Approach Reporting Year 3. We're going to present some great info so you can gain key insights on how to improve your conflict minerals reporting this year. So today, you may be joining us if you didn't file last year but are required to. Dodd-Frank 1502 doesn't apply to you, but your customers are requesting data. Or you filed last year and you've got way too much on your plate and conflict minerals reporting is taking too much time. You want a more efficient and effective approach for collecting data, or you just want to learn about the industry trends so you can benchmark your program. So we're going to talk about all of this today. Some brief introductions. This is Alexandria Bennett from Source Intelligence, and I will be moderating today's webinar. We will hear first from Jennifer Krause. She is our co-founder of Source Intelligence and has over 25 years of experience in EH&S management system services to customers globally. Prior to co-founding Source Intelligence, Dr. Krause was president of Global Environmental Consulting Company, an EH&S consulting practice based in San Diego, California. Dr. Krause was also an associate with Dames & Moore, environmental manager for General Dynamics Electronics Division, and safety engineer with Litton Guidance and Control System. And after Jennifer's presentation, we will hear from Danny Ung. Danny brings a wealth of knowledge to us today as he has managed multiple conflict minerals campaigns and programs since the start of Dodd-Frank 1502. His background is in environmental science as he graduated from the University of California, Los Angeles for his bachelor's. Environmental conservation is a passion of his and has managed multiple land and habitat restoration projects in Southern California. Before we get started, we have some general housekeeping to go over. All PowerPoint slides and a recording of this webinar will be emailed once available. It will also be made available on our website, sourceintelligence.com/webinar library. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them into the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will follow up via email after the webinar. You can also email questions directly to education@sourceintelligence.com. Let's take a look at today's agenda. First up, we will hear from Jennifer Krause with an update on Dodd-Frank 1502, and then we will look at conflict minerals program data to see how you should plan your program. Danny will then go into details about tips for success to improving your program. All right, let me hand the mic to Jennifer so she can get started.
Well, thank you, Alexandria, for the wonderful introduction, and welcome everybody. I'm very happy to be speaking with you all today. To get started, let's talk a little bit of background with regard to the evolution of Dodd-Frank 1502, sort of where we're at today. Year 3 of conflict minerals reporting, of course, has been talked about quite a bit since the inception of the Section 1502. Because of the option to report DRC undeterminable, was intended to go away, forcing issuers, publicly traded companies subject to the rule, to file as either not found to be DRC conflict-free or DRC conflict-free. In the case of a conflict-free distinction, issuers would be subject to an IPSA, an independent private sector audit. Since in reporting year 2015, so in the 2015 filings, we only saw 6 IPSAs performed, the cost, timing to complete an audit, there wasn't a lot of data and information with regard to it. So there's been a bit of uncertainty among CM filers with regard to, the ins and outs of IPSAs, what to expect, etc. Now, as many of you probably know, NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers, along with several other business organizations, brought on a lawsuit that challenged the conflict minerals rule. In 2014, the Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit basically concluded that the requirement to describe products as having not found to be DRC conflict-free is compelled speech that violates the First Amendment, and then confirmed its decision in August of 2015. So in October of last year, so now we're October of 2015, the SEC and Amnesty International filed petitions against the compelled speech distinction, which were denied by the court. Although the SEC has until February of this year to file a petition for a writ of cert, which would seek the U.S. Supreme Court review of the appellate court's decision, it's unlikely the reporting requirements will change before the SEC filing deadline of May of this year, of 2016. So, as a result, companies should continue to follow the guidance that the SEC provided at the end of 2014. While you may not have to specifically declare DRC conflict-free or not, found to be DRC conflict-free, you still, of course, do have to file with the SEC. You've got to conduct your due diligence, and you still have to disclose to the SEC what your due diligence process looks like. So hopefully you're all followed along with that. It's been quite fun to watch all of the legal proceedings. So let's move on then to, so that's a good by way of background. Let's move on to talk about timing of all of this, and specifically timing of year 3, because we've learned quite a bit over the last couple of years. So on the next slide, I'm just going to hit on a couple of key issues that we believe are important to consider to make sure that you are well prepared and have sufficient time to collect your data, validate your data, engage in due diligence prior to preparing and submitting your SEC filing. And so it's important to, right from the beginning, even from the early steps, when it takes when it's time to collect supplier data and product data from within your organization, that can be a bit more time-consuming than you might initially consider. Not only collecting the data, but then going through and cleaning that information, making sure that you've got accurate and up-to-date contact information for your suppliers, that the product identification numbers or other identifiers are matched between your enterprise and that within your supplier network. We've seen numerous times where those don't always necessarily match, so that takes some time to manage and deal with, along with them preparing and the engagement or outreach to your suppliers. All of that has to be done before you even begin collecting data from within your supply chain. And of course, as many of you know, those response rates, and we're going to look at some specific data here in a minute, but as you all know, those response rates can vary pretty significantly. And once you collect the data from those suppliers, it's important to go through and validate those data, and that will take time as well. The quality control process to check and ensure that the information that you are gathering and collecting from your suppliers is plausible, is as accurate as possible, because you will be compiling and aggregating that information to put into a filing that will then go on to the SEC. So very important to make sure that the timeline that you have prepared takes that into account. So today I'm excited because I'm going to be able to share with you some multi-industry data on response rates, common errors, error corrections, and time to completion. As many companies don't specifically report on these details, and it can be challenging to benchmark yourself or even properly allocate resources, internally or external resources, to ensure that you have sufficient time to develop, implement, and complete a program for conflict minerals compliance, and I should say a successful program. So let's move on to take a look at some of this data. And first we're going to look at response times and response times by industry. So we just took a representative sample of filings from within our cohort of data. And I have to say, give a big shout out to Eric Lessert, one of our data scientists here, because he helped aggregate and analyze and pull these data. So he's done a really neat job, and I think that's why we've got some really great stuff to share with you today. But basically, what we did was we went in and evaluated the average time that it takes for a single supplier to respond to a request, and then average that by industry group. Now, mind you, we are referring to the initial response or initial upload. So we're not, this particular representation of data here, pardon me, does not include the multiple and subsequent engagements with a supplier to get those data. So we're referring to the initial response and initial upload. And we'll go into detail a little bit further about the timing for error correction and completion in a minute. But what you see here, now, if you look at the individual dots, so the individual dots on the graph represent various industry groups. And they're the industry groups in the 2014 reporting year and 2015. So now I realize that, here it is mid-January. No, late January already. Time flies when you're having fun, right? I realize that there's still some time remaining to respond to 2015 supplier requests. But it's interesting. This comparison and the contrast here is very obvious. It's pretty significant. But truth of the matter is, we still expect the time to respond in this reporting year to not spread out too drastically. So we can see these data indicate that the variability in response time has gone down significantly in 2015. So we're able to make better and more accurate predictions about supplier time to respond to a request for data. In a minute, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Danny Ong, one of our Conflict Minerals program managers. Actually, he's one of our team leads, program management team leads. And he's going to talk specifically about strategies and best practices to help continuously improve upon this average response time. But I'm going to continue here in a minute before I turn this over to you, Danny, and just share some additional data with everyone here. So let's take a look at the pooled average time to respond by industry. So, take a little bit deeper dive here further and look at the average time to respond when the 2014 and 2015 years are pooled. So this is pooled data. This is not, obviously there's just the one box plot here. So if you are evaluating the timing for your program, we'd suggest it's probably safe to allocate between 30 to 50 days between the time you send that initial request for data and that time of first response. Now, again, this is average data. We've taken it from a representative sample, but what this will do is help you provide justification for resources, and hopefully will help guide you when you put together your overall program plan and are building response times and other timing factors into your overall compliance program. So I thought this would be interesting to share with you all as well. Now, as we all know, goes without saying that complete, not just complete, but accurate declarations are essential for a successful conflict minerals compliance program. So one of the things you'll want to be on the lookout for are inconsistencies in those declarations themselves. So for instance, if a supplier has marked the box, checked the box on that CMRT that they have listed and provided smelters, but there aren't actually any smelters listed, then that's an example of an error, and you'll want to go back to that supplier to fix that error and address that inconsistency. one of the nice things about utilizing an automated system and a web-based platform such as that we offer here at Source Intelligence is that this quality control check is built in. It's automated, and suppliers can be pinged directly and automatically to go in and fix the data. Another example might be identifying the wrong metal for a particular smelter. If it's known that a particular smelter or refiner only processes gold and a particular supplier has identified tin, then again, that's another flag that would be raised and would need to be addressed to, again, improve the consistency and accuracy of that data. So let's take a look at another graph here, another box plot. Now this is the average errors per declaration by industry. So again, these dots, as I mentioned earlier, each one of those is an industry sector. And here you can see that you can expect between anywhere from 10 to 50 errors per declaration, with the median just under 30 errors per declaration. So that's pretty significant when you think about number one, the quality of the data, but number two, the level of effort that might be involved in improving that data. And actually, there's a third thing there too, right? If you don't have a system to go back out and improve the accuracy of the data to address those errors, think about the implications associated with filing a declaration with an entity such as the SEC with data that are not accurate. So this is a really important, I think, a very important piece of knowledge and information to have, and that is that, by far, most declarations will have a median of about 30 errors. So, again, pretty significant. Let's look a little bit more detail about the average errors per declaration. So, once again, now this is a comparison. So we're looking here at, the 2014 and 2015. And we do see the data indicate the average number of errors per declaration by industry is going down. And although the average stays about consistent across all those industries, overall, it's going down. There's one outlier there, and I think it's the, that's the healthcare equipment and services, and I think that's something we're going to have to keep an eye on closer as this reporting year continues on. I think there may be something there to do that there are fewer filings in 2014 versus 2015. This is count data. But overall, the general trend is that the average number of errors per declaration is going down this reporting year. We've also found that the initial communication and education sets precedents for improved and favorable supplier relationships and aids in a more complete declaration and a declaration with fewer errors. So the more aware your supplier base is, the more educated that supply chain is, you're not only likely to get a more complete declaration, but the number of errors on that declaration, so rather than being about 30 or so, are going to be closer to that 10 or even less. So that's an important piece of information to keep on hand as well, and that is that it might be worth utilizing, for instance, our Conflict Minerals Resource Center or other educational and awareness resources to help improve your supplier responsiveness and frankly, just their understanding of why you're requesting this information in the first place. And so now here we have a really interesting graph to share with you. And so let's see. First thing to note here is that, and this is important because I think it's important, it's kind of interesting actually, it's likely that only 1 in 5 of the errors on a template will be corrected without additional effort. So in other words, that means that only about 20% of the errors that show up on a conflict minerals reporting template will be fixed without some extra engagement or extra poking and prodding. So, when errors are identified, most suppliers are not going to respond unless you go and implement some additional resources to get those response rates. So most industries, there's not one particular, as you can see, industry sector that's different than another. Most industries are going to need resources, primarily human resources, technology resources. They're going to be either internal or external resources to not only check their data for errors, but to further engage to correct those errors. So you'll need a more strategic effort to get those suppliers to respond. So it'll be both a combination of tactics and strategy. But I thought this was really interesting statistic that you all might enjoy learning about. So, moving on here, if you're planning on your program now or are curious about benchmarking your program, I'll just put this summary back up here again. But keep in mind, if you intend to complete your program, without an automated tool or with limited resources, you will have some quality issues, some data quality issues that you should be prepared to address. And if you do want to correct those quality issues, it will take time to do so. And after you complete your QC error corrections, you're going to need to determine with your internal team or other stakeholders. You'll have to spend some time with regard to the content of your final report. And there are, our experience with our enterprise customers is that sometimes that internal review period can take longer than you think. So it's got to go through several different sets of eyes to get the sign-off before it's okay to be filed with the SEC. So time. Again, I'm hitting on this timing issue, and that is because it's important to make sure that you've allocated enough time for the resources that you need, internal, external, for all of these different steps. So what I'd like to do now is, Danny has been waiting very patiently for me to finish up here, but I'd like to just turn this over directly to Danny. He's going to share some really interesting ideas and suggestions, best practices for how to improve the success of your conflict minerals compliance efforts, and sort of with having set the stage with the data, I think that these strategies and tactics are going to be very, very relevant. So, Danny, I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Krause. As you've seen, we have experienced a decreased response time and fewer errors per declaration since last year's supplier engagement. So we're going to discuss some tips that have contributed to these changes and will help you in your own conflict minerals programs. The first tip is the categorization of suppliers. The Source Intelligence platform has a tagging feature by which our clients create categories and sort suppliers as they wish. Often our clients will choose to pick categories based on region, spend, or the client's downstream customer. Additionally, prioritizing suppliers by the likelihood of their products containing 3TG can save you valuable time and effort. By adopting this practice, you can customize your communication to your suppliers for maximum efficiency and efficacy. In a bit, I'll go over how this form of customization can lead to an increase in overall supplier response rate, decreased response time, and fewer errors per declaration. Another primary message I want to convey is that the customer's attitude toward their conflict minerals program sets a precedent for all of their suppliers. That's why it's important to determine what your conflict minerals policy is regarding your suppliers. Your suppliers may not be motivated to provide any CM information to you if they do not feel it will negatively impact them. Many companies will inform their suppliers that non-compliance may harm the business relationship between them. Take some time to determine what measures you will take against non-compliant suppliers and be prepared to enforce those measures. Many of you will have noticed through your conflict minerals programs that the stronger your relationship with the suppliers, the better the results. As you build credibility with your suppliers, they will be more willing to ask questions if they don't understand the request instead of ignoring it completely. The successes that our clients have experienced so far are due in part to these relationships strengthening. Suppliers that share a good relationship with the customer will go further to ensure the customer satisfaction through compliance. As you've seen, response times are tending to decrease. The initial communication to your suppliers is very important for emulating the success. Communications are effective when you directly ask for what you need up front. As we noted earlier, it's important to outline the consequences of noncompliance. However, it's also important to point out what the supplier has to gain through compliance. The data that you are requesting is essential for creating your SEC filings and improving your public image. For example, let's take a look at one of our large retail customers. This customer communicated to their suppliers the importance of their public image and ethical sourcing. They stressed that they could not achieve these goals without the participation of their valued suppliers. It's important to also provide educational resources up front before they must submit information to allow suppliers to familiarize themselves with the nature of the request and the regulation. Now I'd like to go into more detail of how the customer can directly help with the response rates. The first tip is to stay involved. Entertain the idea of sending reminders to your suppliers on a regular basis. Regular emails will show the suppliers that you have not forgotten that they have not submitted the requested information to you. Equally as important is ensuring the currency of your supplier contact information. In order to get a high response rate, you need to speak to the appropriate person in the correct manner. Make sure you have a list of contacts that is specific to the task and remove anybody that states they are not the right person for the job. This is such an important part of the process that Source Intelligence has a whole supplier engagement team dedicated to seeking out the right contacts at each company. A lot of time can be wasted trying to find the proper person to deal with conflict mineral issues. So stay up to date as possible. As previously stated, it's a good idea to tag suppliers by region. This will allow you to communicate to your suppliers based on their primary language. Having somebody on your team that speaks the language of your suppliers will prove to be indispensable. If you're not using a third-party organization that has multilingual support, consider hiring out a translation service. Improved response times and fewer declaration errors can be attributed to education materials translated to many languages, such as those available in the Conflict Minerals Resource Center. Make an effort to acquaint yourself with the different cultures that comprise your supplier base. Respecting customs leads to ready cooperation and higher compliance rates. Some people will outright refuse to pay attention to an email that is not in their primary language. Be cognizant of working hours around the world and try to contact suppliers when you know that they'll be in the office. Be aware of national holidays. For example, if you try to send a wave of emails to your suppliers in China during Chinese New Year, you won't get very many emails in return. This is especially important for organizations that need to maximize their limited resources. If you are effective in the initial communication, then it'll save you time throughout the rest of your program. Dodd-Frank Section 1502 is among one of the many emerging supply chain transparency regulations. It's important that you adopt a system that allows you to incorporate any future materials into your regulatory practices. Dodd-Frank is not the first and will not likely be the last regulation that requires you to understand and communicate with your supply chain. In addition to regulated materials, emphasis on non-regulated materials is also emerging. An example of this emergence is the tracking of ethically sourced cobalt in recent news. You may not be required to monitor these materials by law, but external stakeholder groups may question their existence in your supply chain. Also, tracing the origin of products will expand beyond the DRC. More information may be needed for additional areas of conflict, as the DRC is not the only area of concern. An example is the upcoming EU Conflict Minerals Regulation, which is expected to cover global areas of conflict. Speaking of which, we'll be presenting a webinar with the EICC and Squire Patent Boggs next week on the EU regulation. Before we conclude, I want to discuss drivers for your program. It's important to note that you choose the level of effort you place on your program. Get sign-off from your internal stakeholders for the level you choose. If your goal is to do the minimum requirement for Dodd-Frank, evaluate the potential risk of external stakeholder scrutiny. The level of disclosure is also a choice you will need to make. A great example is a client of ours that had a comprehensive compliance program, met all the requirements of Dodd-Frank, and actually achieved 100% responses from their suppliers, but chose to minimally disclose their efforts on their CMR and website. Because of this, they did not rank as well with an external NGO. They were still compliant with SEC, but were not recognized for their comprehensive efforts. At the end of the day, what you disclose is the choice of your internal stakeholder team. Just remember, socially responsible investors, consumers, and other stakeholders may want to know about your sourcing practices. In conclusion, the tips we provide will help optimize your conflict minerals compliance program. Categorize your suppliers to customize your communications. After all, suppliers are not all created equal. Set realistic expectations and prepare to make changes if these expectations are not met. Systemize data collection for future materials and regulations.
Well, thank you, Danny, and thank you, Jennifer, for sharing with our audience today. As a reminder, this webinar recording and slides will be emailed to you shortly after we conclude. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to email education@sourceintelligence.com. We have many resources available on our website, in our webinar library, or if you would prefer to read something instead, check out our white paper library. Also, Danny had mentioned an upcoming webinar next week regarding the EU Conflict Minerals Regulation. If you believe you could be affected by that upcoming regulation, definitely sign up for the webinar, as we will have experts from the EICC and Squire Patent Boggs presenting. As mentioned multiple times in today's presentation, educating your supply chain is an essential part of a successful conflict minerals program. So definitely check out the Conflict Minerals Resource Center with the link on the screen. All right, folks, that's it. This is Alexandria Bennett again with Source Intelligence. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your week and weekend.